Well, hello to you both. Welcome back to New Musical Chairs, a post-punk podcast. I am Jay, and it is time. We are talking about goth on this episode, not just post-punk anymore, my friends, goth. And to do that, I need a very special guest, and a very special guest I have indeed. This episode, I'm joined by Cathi Unsworth. I am so thrilled that Cathi agreed to be on the podcast with me. We had a fantastic chat, and we'll get into that in a moment. Cathi released last May, she released Season of the Witch, the Book of Goth, one of several weighty tomes on the goth subculture that were released last year, but this one just clinches it for me as my favourite because it really gets you to the heart of what made that subculture so special, the rise of the music and what it meant to people to be there, and you really get a sense of what it was like to be there, you know, through these many disparate forms of art, from cinema, music, visual art, and young people trying to find their way against a backdrop of really quite terrifying social and political upheaval. Miners' strikes, mass unemployment, the dole office with a queue down the street, you know. It was a scary time, and unfortunately tumultuous times usually are a great breeding ground for art, as was the case with the Season of the Witch. So, without further ado, please leave a like, subscribe if you haven't already, comment, either have a bitch, have a moan, or just be nice, you know, whichever you fancy. If you're watching this on YouTube, hello. If you're listening on the other platforms, hello. And I'm really looking forward to getting into this. Part 1, we're going to be talking about Season of the Witch, Cathi's book, in immense detail, how she came to write it, how she got it all together, and a few little other snippets about her time, her point of view, growing up as part of the subculture. Part 2, we've put together a goth primer for you. We've each picked 10 goth records that mean the most to us. Not necessarily saying they're the best, but just ones that we love. We changed our lists several times. So if you're looking for a primer to get into goth music, or you're a veteran of the scene and just fancy having a trip down memory lane, maybe you want a new playlist to listen to, stick around for part 2. That will be available somewhere up here, over here, if you're watching this on YouTube. If not, I'll link to it in the description for all of these, wherever you happen to listen. Without further ado, here's Cathi. I guess to kind of, you know, start off with the obvious thing, talk about Season of the Witch, fabulous book, and I flew through it, and I got it on Christmas Day. I read it in 3 days.
Oh, wow.
You know, sorry, Mum, for, you know, dipping into it over Christmas dinner. And it's an interesting time because goth has kind of had this strange resurgence in pop culture with, you know, the Wednesday Addams program. A lot of people have been kind of doing goth things on TikTok. Bauhaus are starting to pop up in people's social media again. There does seem this little resurgence of goth. And I suppose my first question to you is, why do you think that is? Why do you think it's come round into the mainstream again?
It's really interesting, isn't it? And I've been talking to a few people who were in my book about this recently, like Justin from New Muscle Army and Barry Adamson, and they basically, and what I think is, the times feel quite similar to the start of the 80s.
Yeah.
I mean, I did deliberately set my book within the brain of Margaret Thatcher, and obviously she is the witch, because I thought it shows how this music was born out of punk and reacted to the social conditions of the time, and how that all really comes to a head in 1984 to 5, along with the miners' strike and the Battle of the Beanfield and the sort of curtailment of that whole old way of life. The end of the Industrial Revolution, but also the end of that whole sort of indie life, that subculture that was running parallel to the mainstream, that was sort of started with punk, and then after that things sort of start looking backwards and getting more hedonistic, and I don't know, but it's like an old world dies and a new world emerges through the period of Margaret Thatcher being in power. And now I feel like we're in a similarly, it was a scary period. I mean, I grew up thinking that Ronald Reagan, you know, the president's brain is missing on spitting image every week. Well, what does this little button here do? That would happen at any moment. And I grew up in Norfolk, which is full of air bases. So, you know, I was under no illusion that if anything kicked off, I'd be atoms within seconds. And I think that the state that the politicians of this world has got us back into right now, it feels as scary as it did. In a way, it was almost comforting going through the 80s again, realizing actually at the end, the Berlin Wall came down and there was a kind of peace, and it wasn't what everyone expected at the first. And maybe even as terrible as things are now, maybe there will be an unexpected resolution. Who knows? But it definitely does feel as scary now to me as it did when I was a little kid growing up in the 80s.
Sure, it is a strange and uncertain time, and I suppose it's one of those things that, uncertain times and times of real upheaval breed, they're great breeding grounds for art,
Yeah, well,
fortunately or unfortunately, you know?
does make for good art. I mean, that's what Justin Sullivan said, when in times when there were peace and stability, maybe my music, you know, didn't have so much to kick against. And, when there's a terrible time, it makes for good art. Gets the anger flowing and.
I love Justin's attitude to the whole thing, because he's there's a few documentaries about New Model Army kicking around, but there's a great quote in one of them that he says about there was a time, wasn't there, when New Model Army were going they looked poised to become almost a stadium band at one point. And he kind of said that he still gets asked about that now, and are you disappointed that you didn't become more successful? And he just sort of said, last time I looked in my fridge, there was food in it.
Yeah,
You know,
indeed. Yes, exactly. I think they view Model Army as a sort of phenomenon because they did. They carried on that road of being what they always were. And they've had enough because of their attitude towards their friends and treating them like a family. I think it sustained them. I think it's the same with Killing Joke, actually. I would say they've always had, and Lydia said this to me, ever since they've started, they've had a certain amount of audience. And even though that audience has changed over
mm.
time, not always the same people, they keep bringing new people into the fold, and it's always given them enough money to sustain them. And it's given them a kind of freedom that you wouldn't have if you were under the cosh of a record company. You get the money for a little while, but they'd expect a certain thing from you, and then they'd start trying to change you. And if you didn't want to change, then you'd be in trouble. So doing that, I know it's a difficult furrow because you never 100% sure of where the next penny is coming from, but you are those bands and those artists. I think it's more like a vocation for them than a sort of lust for power or glory that quite a lot of rock and roll can be about.
It's
Those,
in it's interesting because I think this is quite a unique phenomenon to bands of that period that people of my generation have never experienced. Because I interviewed Wayne Hussey from the Mission for another, and Sisters, of course, for another project I'm working on, and he kind of said that you know he still doesn't see the Mission as a goth band, and I kind of went, sure, okay, Wayne. Um, but I think his whole thing was, if it wasn't for them, I wouldn't be here. And I think it's kind of there's an interesting thing with bands from this time, New Model Army, Killing Joke, like you said,
mm,
whereby, and even at a not quite so, maybe not at the theatre level, but at club level, bands like Theatre of Hate and
yeah,
they all have this core of fans who still follow them everywhere, even now.
and they are all really good live as well. That's the other thing to say about them.
Do you think it's because, obviously we'll talk about the sort of the subcultural aspects of goth later on, but do you think it's because they cultivated their following as a culture rather than just, this kind of it's not a transactional relationship between who's on stage and who's in the audience. It's like they're all part of the same gang. It's just that these four or these five happen to be the ones yelling at
Indeed.
everybody.
Yeah, they're the shamans for the tribe, if you want to put it like that. They're doing the thing, their ritual, they're initiating the ritual, and their gang, it's all part. I mean, I don't know if you saw this, is quite funny, and I meant to ask Justin, and I wish I had, but I didn't. If you saw that, there was a really brilliant series that I watched over lockdown called Britannia. And it was,
Yes.
yeah, and how the arch druid looks like Brian Gregory from The Cramps, which is Mackenzie Crook, the evil, where he's got two, hasn't he? The good druid and the bad. The arch druid, the evil one, looks exactly like Brian Gregory. And all the ancient Britons look like New Model Army fans. That's really hysterically fun.
But they really do, yeah.
Because the people that made that are probably my age. And I always thought that, New Model Army looked like a tribe from ancient Britain with their clogs and their leathers and their supporters. And Jules tattooed everybody up, and not her tattoo. She looks like Queen Boadicea to me.
Yeah.
That's when I first saw a picture of her, I thought, oh, that's who she is. Could just see her on a chariot with heads on the sides of it. So
I kind of look, Justin, particularly when he used to wear his military regalia and he had the French plait, which I was always jealous of because I still can't French plait. He probably didn't do it himself, he might have done, but he always just looked like a highwayman to me, like he should be looting jewels,
Yeah, he did, yeah. I think him and Jules did, like, they met when the Romans were invading and they were like fighting them off.
Yeah. So, Season of the Witch has been out, like I said before we started recording, almost a year, May 2023, on Bonnier Book, more than a few Book of the Year awards, and rightly so. I suppose my first question about the book is, why now? Why go back through the time tunnel? I suppose I should make mention of John Williams and Pete Woodhead, who you credit in the acknowledgements.
John was he was my editor on all my crime novels. And if it weren't for him, I might not have been published in the first place. And so he's like a really fantastic older brother figure. And so is Pete. Pete's somebody that I worked with, and I worked at Bazaar magazine. He was the head of IT at John Brown Publishing in the good old days of that. And he lives near me, and we've for 25 years, we did a film club of just going around each other's houses to watch obscure films with our friend Jay, who sadly died about a year ago. And my book was dedicated to both of them, and sadly Jay didn't see it. But anyway, they all nagged me that I should write a book about goth, because if I didn't, somebody would, and they wouldn't say it as good as me. And they kept nagging at me, and so I started on a long train journey once. I started doing a timeline of 80s of Margaret Thatcher's reign. And I thought, if I do this book, that's going to be my spine of my book, because I want all this political stuff to be in there, because it's really important that people think that goth is just this frivolous, miserable, and also a bit of the softy youth culture, because gosh, they're readers, and that's like a really bad thing to want to be educated and know stuff, right? So how dare we know fancy learning words and all that kind of thing. Anyway, so I wanted it to show that it was an opposite. And anyway, then another friend of mine called Stephen Coates, who is one of these brilliant Renaissance men. He's in a band called The Real Tuesday World. He's a brilliant author as well. And he does loads of cultural events, and at the brilliant London cemeteries, he's programmed stuff there. And he asked me if I would talk about Gothic music. And it was supposed to be for Walpurgisnacht on 2020. So I started going back in the archives and looking at all this stuff. Origins of Goth, he wanted me to write. So I started doing that, and found all this really interesting stuff that I, really quite eye-opening stuff. And I got to the point where I'd written a talk that would last an hour, which was about 5,000 words. And then the Grim Reaper, COVID, came in and cut that off. But I still have this document, and I thought, I don't want to stop now. This stuff is really interesting, and I can do it. And I worked out how I could do it. So I turned that into a book proposal, which took about another year, to be honest, because just planning how I was going to fit all this stuff into one book was quite, and I really wanted it to be in 13 chapters as well. That was quite important to me. So, but once I'd cracked that, and once I'd met Pete, and Pete was quite happy for me to write it the way, and I think it's good that Pete was sort of starting up a new company as well, and he came from a background of being a music fan. He worked in HMV. He wasn't quite a lot of people who weren't interested in it at more mainstream publishing houses didn't come from that background and they thought it was too niche, that no one, just, 30 million Cure fans can be wrong, apparently.
Well,
Not
the
enough
thing I
people.
was going to say to that is, even if it's niche, it's goth, right? So, okay, let's say there's 1,000 people out there clamoring for this. All 1,000 of them will buy it like
Yeah,
that,
goths are readers, as we've just said.
because it,
Yeah.
and we're a strange. I think there's a crossover with record collectors here, and unfortunately, I happen to be both, which means my bank balance is never that healthy. You know, I don't.
Ah,
I don't need another copy of First and Last and Always, but did I buy one when the last God knows how many reissues came out? Of course I did.
yeah.
Um,
No, we like our precious things as well, and yeah, it's true. That's why I had those bits in the book
yeah.
about reading the Gothic library and midnight movies and all that stuff, because it all feeds in.
The Midnight Movies section, for anybody who hasn't read the book, I suppose the Midnight Movies section, I'll just flash my copy up here for anybody who hasn't seen it. I mean, if you haven't seen it, why haven't you? What's wrong with you? But the Midnight Movie section's been great for me because it's one of those little asides that you kind of think, oh yeah, goth can exist in cinema as well. And there are some movies in there I'd seen. There were some movies I hadn't seen. And I think it's a really lovely way of showing the reach of this thing we call goth, and how the reach of subversion in all forms of art.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. Like the link between, say, Soft Cell and John Waters, and yeah,
Yeah,
it's brilliant.
it is. And
Yeah.
it sounds like from the outset you had quite a clear vision of what you wanted to achieve in terms of setting it within Thatcher's reign. And as you
Yeah.
say, it's not just that this stuff was going on at the same time. This was a massive part of why the culture kicked off in the first place and why it kind of went the way that it did. So did that give you, I suppose that gave you a fairly deliberate timeline within which to work, but did did you kind of see it, certainly when you started working on it, did you see that as being elastic in terms of, oh, I really want to talk about this and it's just outside that timeline, or were you kind of pretty martial and go, no, this is what it's going to be?
I did really want it to just be the reign of Margaret Thatcher and what happened within that time. But I also, because I wanted to show the antecedents of Goth, and and the whole history of the Gothic in our culture. That's why I had the Goth mothers and Goth fathers, so I could go back as far in time
Yeah.
as I needed to there as well.
I
But with
like the way you framed. I like that the political angle and the Goth fathers, Goth mothers segments feel like intermissions within the narrative, and they were really great ways of breaking that up and kind of. I think. What am I trying to say? They frame the impact they had on the narrative. What led to you structuring it like that?
I think it is because two things really. Because I've been a magazine journalist for most of my life, and the two magazines that I really enjoyed working on, as well as obviously Sound, which was more of, that was was Bizarre, and also working on Mojo's special features, which
Yeah,
were the ones where you just have a volume on Led Zeppelin, let's say, or The Doors, and you get all the articles they'd ever written about them and all stuff, for fans and little. So it was that, and it was how you broke up features. And we used to do that in Bizarre and Mojo with sidebars on related subjects. And, if you want to find out more about this, here's
yeah,
website that go to, here's. So all of that, like it's a big magazine article. And that's how, and because I did Jordan's book before, and that was me the first time I went back into doing non-fiction from doing 6 crime fiction books. So, and Jordan's book was very much, she wanted it to be a social history of her life and times rather than her life story. She wanted it to be a pop culture guide to the 70s as well as, and all the people that she'd been involved with in that time culturally. So in a way, Goss followed on from that Now, as Jordan leaves the stage, which she did sort of in the early 80s, and she went back to Seaford and became a retrained as vet. All Susie, who was in the shop at the same time, she's carrying on, Howard Devote, and he's carrying on. And they're something completely different. I mean, say punk, as Jim Thirlwell says, punk was the big bang. And then all these millions of the universe expands and all these parallel universes come out of that in
I
that
was going to
really
quote
rich and
that
fertile.
later on because I just think that I've written that down since reading it, and that's it. I don't think there's a better encapsulation than that. And you kind of think, gosh, yeah, that's quite a profound way of putting it. And I think, like you said, none of these bands really sound like each other, but they all kind of have this common thread of, you know, coming from this year zero idea of. I have this discussion with some of the people I speak to in terms of what punk actually means to them, and I kind of think
Yeah.
I think of it less as less of a style of music and more just more than the ethos that kind of came out of that.
I mean, that's why I put the bit at the beginning about Malcolm McLaren and Margaret Thatcher's guru, Alfred Sherman.
Yeah,
Because I'd obviously knew quite a lot about Malcolm and his methods from Dean Jordan's book. But then when I read it was Peter York's book on the 80s, and he said something about Alfred Sherman being crazed with ideas and wanting to inflict them on everybody. And that's it. He might as well have been talking about Malcolm, who he knew as
yeah,
well. So, and I think those two came along at the same time and they disrupted everything.
yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Um, when you went back and read through, old notes, interviews, and things when you were working on this, was there anything looking back at it now that surprised you or that you'd forgotten about that you think, oh, I've got to put that in there?
But one of the things, the first thing that when I was just writing this as a talk was having The Cure described as a no image band. And when you think that Robert Smith is like, there's probably a Robert Smith in every town, village, across the known
Yeah,
world, there will be. And his look is sort of him and Susie, I guess, would have the most imitated look. But I reckon him even more because his look is more achievable in a way. I was like, I never thought I could ever look as cool as Susie, but I thought I could do my hair like a nest of tarantulas and wear my dad's pajamas and my mum's diamante necklace, and it would be okay.
I think it's really funny that you say that because I do sometimes think with Robert's look, if you sketch it out on a piece of paper and show it to somebody without telling them what it is, even if they don't have any knowledge of the scene or even really who the Cure are, they'll at least go, "Oh, it's that guy," you
Yeah,
know. And there aren't too many people you could say that about.
exactly. And it's also quite interesting how, he has when it's after he meets Susie and the Banshees that this look develops when he's hanging out with, and they really are stylish, those people. I mean, Susie really is.
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone that's passed through that band um, has something to offer on the style front, and you just think, damn, you just look so good. I mean, like John McGeoch, who I could talk about all day. Um, even he, who kind of was probably the least showy of that lineup of the four of them. Again, there was this sort of highwayman thing about him, a sort of a silent danger there.
Yeah.
Were there any artists or records that were kind of outside that timeline that you wish you could have included?
Well, there's a whole bit in your choice of records that you've drawn upon, which I didn't, because that David Keenan's book, England's Hidden Reverse,
Yes,
is such a brilliant book about all those bands.
yes, it is.
I just thought I don't even want to go there. And then, to be honest, the bands that I've written about are the bands that, for me, were the most important ones and that I
Sure.
understand and have met and have liked. Haven't met all of them actually, but these are the things that were my soundtrack of growing up. Whereas I didn't discover Coil and all that lot till later, actually, and that was through probably Thirlwell and Mark Ullman.
Yeah.
And so, in my head, didn't exist in the same way, this might sound a bit weird, as all those other bands did that I was buying their records and going to see them play in that.
Sure.
And also, but it was as well for that reason. I think he's done a brilliant book about that. So if you want to know a really good history of that, there you go. That's why I think there is room for more than one book about goth. Obviously, there is. And
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's rare that the subculture gets taken seriously. And when I say that, I guess I mean within any kind of literary medium. So the more the merrier, as far as I'm concerned.
yeah, I mean, yeah, if you wanted to write a book about that side of it, then you should, you know. And
Yeah.
there's some bands that come along a bit later on, as well as some guy that came to one of my talks, and he was really sad that I hadn't put Fields of the Nephilim in, and because they were, you know, within the time frame. And I thought about this quite a lot because I did meet them and interview them, and I did think they were. But the thing is with them, I don't think they're the originators. I think the Sisters of Mercy are. Right?
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to see the sisters, you know, with Gary Marks in, and after seeing that, and they were my favourite band. Then at the end of the 80s, seeing Fields of the Nephilim, the first time I saw them was upstairs at the Clarendon, that sadly now defunct venue that your dad used to go to. He was probably in the audience as well. But it was so, at the time to me, when I first saw Fields of the Nephilim, I just thought, I'm sorry, but you are taking the piss, aren't you? Because it was like what you would now call cosplay, or like, let's all dress up like the sisters and go boo and have, you know, Ennio Morricone guitars. But loads of friends of mine, and I was only like 1 or 2 years older than them, who never got to see the sisters. That was the band they loved the most, and I totally understand that and get that.
It's interesting because I think, from my perspective, with a band like Fields of the Nephilim, they kind of have this. They occupy a bit of a strange space for me because the first album, Dawn Razor, yeah, I mean, there's so much worship in that. It is almost bordering on parody at times. It's not a criticism per se. The thing that is a criticism is when you read interviews with them from that time, and they absolutely will not admit to that.
Yeah, no,
You know?
that's what I mean. That's why. Yeah.
But I think when they did the self-titled and when they did Elysium, they started to kind of find their own patch of ground a little bit more with the Crowley stuff, and you know, they started to explore other textures. But the thing is, for me, it's an interesting one. It almost feels, and I know there will be, if there's any Fields of the Nephilim fans watching this, they will be furiously raging at me for saying this. They felt like the start of an idea that would be elaborated on and, I would argue, concluded on by a band like Opeth from Sweden, who took that idea, applied it to modern metal and progressive music, and then kind of, to me, the Nephilim is almost like the start of what Blackwater Park would do 15 years later.
I think it's a totally different story from the one I'm talking about, and that's why I didn't put them in there.
That's it, yeah, that's it.
Also, there were certain people that never get talked about, like Lydia Lunch, and
yeah,
their cramps are it's hardly remembered very much about them, and Mark and the Mambas and that, who've all got really amazing female presences to them that never get their say. And I wanted to acknowledge how important goth was for women and also for gay people.
I think Mark gets left out of this conversation in the broader sense because people just see him as the guy from Soft Cell, whereas he was a lot more than that. You know, he was involved in the scene up in Leeds, and like you say, with Mark and the Mambas as well.
How
which
brave was he to walk around Leeds looking like that in them days? I mean, but you could get killed for less than that in Yarmouth, where I grew up, and yeah. So, and you know, when I did Jordan's book, a key moment for the punk generation was the one of seeing David Bowie and Mick Ronson on top of the Pops.
Sure.
My equivalent of that was seeing Soft Cell doing Tainted Love. Like, oh my God, there's something really different about him. And, you know, he looks dangerous. He looks like sleazy and pervy and dangerous. And so, therefore, I'd quite like to get to know him.
Absolutely.
you know, and I also Annie Hogan, his sort of musical partner and all the members and all of that, she's so important to the story. She wrote so much beautiful music, and she's quite shy, Annie, and doesn't really go into the spotlight. But I think her genius should be acknowledged and
I agree because
Lydia and
I have those Mambas records, and when I first got them, so a really strange aside, this was pre being able to just look anything up online. I came to Mark and the Mambas through a TV show called Being Human, which was about a vampire, a werewolf, and a ghost sharing a house in Bristol. That came out in the, I know, right? Came out in the mid to late 2000s, I think, and there's a guy in it who references Mark and the Mambas and is seen dancing to A Promise by Echo and the Bunnymen at a retro 80s night, but he's a ghost, so they can't see him. It's all very complicated. But yeah, and he mentioned Mark and the Mambas, and he plays. There's a song from the Untitled album that plays in the background of this scene, and I was like, oh my God, I've got to know who this is. And then I connected the dots, and I went, oh my, it's that Mark Armand, right? And you say about Annie, I think the thing that was such a shock to me is obviously how different the music is, and I don't know because she tends to stay out of the spotlight these days. But I get the feeling that Annie really was the drive behind a lot of that.
well, all the music he makes with her sounds completely different
Yeah,
from music without her, let's put it that way. So, and I think they made their, most wonderful music together, and I think they were important role models for our generation, if I can say that. But I think it was really interesting. Annie said that actually on the podcast she did with Martin Ware on his Electronically Yours, that she had two singles when she was little, and one of them was Telstar, and the other one was Downtown by Petula Clark and Telstar by The Tornadoes, obviously produced by Joe Meek. And I think elements of those two singles have gone into everything she does, and it's a brilliant winning combination, actually.
absolutely. And I mean, Joe Meek, the way that Joe Meek produced records, especially given the limited amount of technology that was available at the time, you could look at him in this sort of proto-punk way or proto-post-punk way, and in the way that he layered sounds, in the way that he used unconventional, Foley stuff or found sound. That's totally, to make a really tenuous link, it's not dissimilar to what Cabaret would do in Sheffield
No, it
15,
won't.
20 years
Oh,
later.
I reckon they would probably acknowledge that. And also, Gothfather Joe Meek doing seances and then writing songs that, and then, going mad and shooting his landlady and himself. How much more
Yeah,
proto-goth do you want?
absolutely. So we've kind of, you mentioned growing up in Yarmouth. Tell me about like your perspective as a young girl growing up, starting to move into the sort of the adult world, as we all eventually have to do, unfortunately. Um, Tell me about your perspective of culture in the UK growing up. What was happening socio-politically? Did you feel that? And were there rays of hope for you? Were those rays of hope just coming from subcultural things, or did you not really feel it in the same way?
Well, first start, my parents hated Margaret Thatcher and were in great opposition to her. My mum especially said she would always say she was a traitor to her class, her sex, and her country. And my mum came from a fairly similar background to Margaret Thatcher. I think that's one of the reasons why she can't stand her so much. But her family were avowedly socialist, unlike,
Yeah,
it was the fact as well that Margaret Thatcher benefited from going to grammar schools and having a really good education, and then took that all away and made education into basically shopkeeping.
yeah,
That's a big reason why my parents didn't like her. But they were in a minority because my parents don't come from Norfolk, but they ended up getting jobs there. And my granddad came from a big coal mining family in South Yorkshire. So obviously when the miners' strike happened, I had a different opinion on that, to be
sure.
honest. And a lot of the evil of the miners' strike, and there's a series about it on again at the moment. And but one of the that my dad sort of said to me later was that they've got police from different parts of the country to come up north and and be more aggressive towards these people because they weren't part of the same community and they didn't understand their way of life either. So, and those coppers that would go up there and go on the front line at places like Orgreave and that, they would get double the money. So they would like be getting, as my dad put it, a lot of fridge freezers got bought, a lot of new carpets got bought from duffing up the miners and
Mm.
splitting the country in two. And so I didn't have a lot of friends that thought the same way about that as me, but I did. It was on the front page of the NME, and like Exmoor from the Redskins writing on the front line of the mines, and that I think the NME, the most out of the papers in those days was really political, and I found more. I could get more information from that, and and when I started going to gigs and getting fanzines and that, I could get information from them as well, and from listening to John Peel, obviously. But it more like when the good thing about being a goth was that you could recognise each other across vast expanses of flat fields, and you knew if you met somebody else that was wearing black and tried to spike their hair up, or however rubbish we were at doing it. We weren't very many good hair products in those days. There's this disgusting green gel that looked like just slightly more solidified fairy liquid, and that's what you were supposed to spike your hair up with.
So I have to tell this story here because it's just so perfectly timed. So sorry, Dad, because I know you'll be listening to this. He was on his way to a Meteors gig. When Nigel, the original upright bass player, was in the band, and they did all that sort of early stuff, In Heaven, Graveyard Stomp, all the kind of more B movie stuff. Yeah,
the best stuff. The first album.
Yeah. He was a mate of my dad's, and so they used to go and see them quite a lot. And my dad decided my dad's got that type of hair that stands up of its own volition anyway. Don't need to do anything to it, and yet he thought it would be a great idea to bleach his hair. But he used domestic bleach. Yeah. And it's sort of, I can't remember how he described it, but he basically said it had the consistency of like a pack of quavers for months afterwards, just sort of, if he did that, it just made this horrendous rustling. So I wish I had like an empty crisp packet to do the sort of ASMR thing in front of the...
Quaver hair.
But yeah, I'll never let him forget that. I don't know why he told me that.
No, there was some horrible hair disasters notice if you didn't understand. Like, one of my friends dyed her hair red with henna, and then she wanted to dye it black, and she put black, and she didn't realise there's a chemical reaction between, and it snapped all. And she said as she was pouring, like trying to wash off the black hair dye, all the rest of her hair was. And can you imagine anything more?
Oh God!
For a young teenage goth,
oh God,
with long hair is going down the plug hole. No.
Oh no! If I look down now and there's more than there should be in the plug hole, I get worried, But no, oh God! I mean, you could probably do a podcast on goth hair disasters. Actually, maybe that's an idea for the future.
And I once almost set my hair on fire with lighting a cigarette, and it went up. But the thing was, there was so much hairspray on it that it was just burning the hairspray. So luckily, by the time I managed to put it out by throwing something on my head, there was hardly any damage done to it. Just like an oil rig burning off the hairspray.
I like the idea that you'd be at a gig or something with this the flaming hair, and someone go, "God, that's a look,"
Yeah, exactly.
When you sort of mentioned about listening to John Peel, starting to meet people. Yeah. When was your entry point to goth? And was that did that kind of come simultaneously when you started reading the music papers, or had you kind of already been primed before goth came along?
Well, I think it's a combination of listening to John Peel, reading the music press, starting with smash hits, and then sort of as I got older, graduating onto sound and NME and Zigzag, which was a really good one.
Yeah.
Probably the most goth one of all. When you could get hold of it, because you couldn't always, but that was that was a good one.
Mick Mercer was over there, wasn't he?
Yeah, Mick Mercer was the editor in its goth years. Chris Needs was the punk, and then Mick, and quite a lot of people that I subsequently met got their first job on Mick Mercer's version of that, of Zigzag. So combination of that, Top of the Pops, and the other thing that is quite interesting. I did Jordan's book. This American guy, Ian I, who worked in the shop with Jordan at 3A Kings Road, said when he came over from America, he thought it was really good that there was less choice. There was only 3 channels, and there's only really John Peel that you could listen to on, because that way you just got a concentrated dose of what it was. There wasn't millions and millions and millions and millions of things to flick through. And then so that when you could, there was almost like a search for the holy grail of things that you could find, which, every lunchtime, when I got a summer job at a guest house, and I'd spend every lunchtime going through all the bargain bins in every record shop trying to find something. And when I found the Doors' first album, it's like, I found the holy grail.
That album I mean, I love all the Doors records, but that first album is just perfect from start to finish.
First and last, I would say, with the Doors, LA Woman is also perfect.
Yes.
In its very noir way. And, James Elroy got a few ideas from that, even though he claims to only listen to Beethoven. I reckon he got a few ideas from that. As
More
well
than
as
a
the
few, I
title
would
Bruce
say.
Killer on the Road. Yeah, indeed. So, yeah, so a combination of, yes, Top of the Pop, sneaking into the pubs underage, which being a goth made that easier as well because the makeup and the hair. But then, the best bit was when I got to go to art college, and I was the youngest person there. Everyone was older. Everyone had better record collections. I could learn from them. I could make my own clothes with proper professional. And I got loads of friends who were at the time, our jeans had to be really as skinny as possible, and I could take them in on the interlocker there, which gave them a professional theme on the inside. So got lots of favors, in return for that, lots of records taped for me, and it was like a whole information exchange. Really.
When did you notice then that punk was starting to change and become this other thing? And what was it? Because post-punk and goth kind of get used interchangeably, which is an interesting. I think because goth is so hard to define, whereas metal, for example, has very, very definable stylistic parameters, even though you can do a million things within that. Goth
hard.
is almost like the culture of, being attracted to darkness, subversion, and all of these kind of ideas. And whatever happens to fall under that, regardless of what those stylistic things are, that's it.
Yeah. Well, and it's even hard because there's even bands that I probably should have put in my book that I didn't. But I will say, like, my older punky friends, the ones that got more into the goth stuff, were the ones that were always into the Damned and the Stranglers more than the Clash and the Pistols. And I think that you can clearly see that obviously Dave Vanian always has looked like a vampire, and he's always been really brought elements of the films he loves. And, the Black Album arguably is the first goth album. And the Stranglers, impressively, one of the first bands I remember seeing on Top of Pops and going, bloody hell, they do look like they would come and kill you. They look like it's what it says on the tin, the Stranglers. They've got black leather gloves on, and they sound like the Doors as well. And
the Stranglers have always been they've always fascinated me because these were guys who could really play, and yet they were accepted as a punk band, and I've always found that really fascinating because everything they do or did is wrong in terms of what was happening around that time. Because I'm unashamedly a big fan of bands like Van der Graaf Generator, and
well, this is the prog element was and I tried to have a bit of a laugh with this in the book because I do, I think that's the reason why magazine went trusted in a way as well, because look at all those keyboards that Dave it could be prog. And why was prog such a crime anyway? Well, it goes back to that never trust a hippie thing. But Dave Vanian and Captain Sensible obviously thought bollocks to that because they were trying to get Syd Barrett to produce their second album. The Banshees put a song from the White Album on their first album. And Steve Severin was a massive fan of Pink Floyd.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it?
He said he lied anyway. When he put I hate Pink Floyd, it was just to be provocative, but he actually secretly... But loads of my friends, it's quite funny, who are a bit older than me, loads of my friends went and destroyed all their prog and metal albums to look cool, and then had to buy them all back again.
I think there's an argument as well, and I like if I could point to one record that sat over here that is an absolute kind of crystallization of why punk needed to happen. It's Tales from Topographic Oceans by Yes, and that's a band I love. But I come back. I probably listen to that album once a year, and even now, it's a slog getting through it. But you take the kind of the darker elements of the prog period, like Van der Graaf Generator. I can hear a bit of that in bits of UK Decay. Werewolf. There's a bit of that in there.
I know, and I think that Howard Devoto's presence on stage kind of reminds me of Peter Gabriel, what he was like in those days.
Yeah, he's got absolutely.
That alien quality about him, and Peter Gabriel was doing Games Without Frontiers and those first 4 solo albums that he did.
They're amazing albums as well.
Goth himself, really.
Yeah, and dressing up as a big old sunflower. I mean,
yeah.
I love the early Genesis stuff with Peter Gabriel. This is completely off topic now, but I love that early Genesis stuff with Peter Gabriel. And I think that the theatrical element of that, which I know a couple of the members of the band really didn't like, it really kind of set them apart. And I think is maybe why that period, and they're kind of like a bit of a frozen in amber band, because you have audiences who like that period of the band who will not listen to any of the Collins stuff, and vice versa. But I think the Peter Gabriel gave them a weirdness and a kind of you never quite knew what was going to happen next. And I think he gave them a theatricality that I think made them continues to make them acceptable to people who really don't like that type of music ordinarily.
They are a gateway into prog. Well, Peter Gabriel is a prog gateway. I definitely agree with that.
For sure. I mean, so has your definition of what constitutes goth changed at all, would you say, over your life?
Well, the thing was, and this is the big joke in the middle of it, you had to go around saying, I'm not a goth in the 80s. And everyone denied it because it was like a term of abuse for like a Johnny come lately, really. It was like you didn't know as much, and you weren't there at the beginning, and you've just heard the Cult, have you? And that's all you've got in your record collection, She Sells Sanctuary. It was really like when I did that thing about it was almost like Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, coming around to your house and instead of looking for your familiars, he was like looking to see how many records you actually had, and how many fanzines were under your bed, and giving you questions about all the various lineups of the Damned, and if you couldn't name them all, then I'm afraid you get the ducking stool. But I think in my head, it was always an identity that I wanted to be part of. I always wanted to be with people that I thought looked beautiful and were really creative, and the music and the films that we watched and the books that we read and all of that, it was against the grain of get married and have kids and settle down, and that's it.
That's it, isn't it? It's like a love of rule breaking, and I think that's why, because I love the fact that you included Jeffrey Lee Pierce in the Gun Club, because I think for a very narrow definition of goth, they would not belong at all, but they absolutely do for me.
Nick Cave would be where he is today if he hadn't seen them.
Absolutely not. And I think Jeffrey Lee's an interesting one. Such a waste given what happened to him. I feel like he had a lot more to say. Um,
Well,
but
it's this problem with people who maybe are a bit too sensitive for this world. They tend to self-medicate with far too many naughty substances to
I
give
think
themselves that bravado to face the world. And
he,
he's an amazingly intelligent person, but he was
yeah,
very self-sabotaging. I mean, as anyone that would have been in a band with him would tell you. But
and I think there's a kinship there between him and the older blues
yeah,
masters. I kind of look at him in this vein of Lead Belly or Son House. These kind of or Blind Lemon Jefferson. These very kind of almost tragic figures who trouble just seems to find them, but
yeah,
because
I
of
agree.
that, they put this incredible body of work out.
And I think Hank Williams as well. And when
Yeah.
he was 29 when he died, Hank Williams, when he drank himself to death. So Jeffrey Lee got 8 years more than Hank.
Mm.
But
C-
yeah, on the Lost Highway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think um,
He was the one that brought the blues back, like the Cramps brought the rockabilly back into, and all psychobilly existed because of the Cramps, because of how bloody scary they looked at the time. That one of my favourite quotes was Sandy Robertson saying it's like Link Ray at Black Mass. That's what they sounded.
absolutely, yeah. God, what a great, yeah, that's a perfect way of describing it, isn't it? It's funny actually because talking about the Gun Club, when my dad, there he is again, when my dad saw the Gun
Cool
Club,
dad, didn't you?
he's very much cooler than I am. He'll love that. You'll love that, won't you? He when he saw the Gun Club, he kind of was shocked at almost because he grew up loving blues and rockabilly. That was kind of what he was into before punk came along, and still is. But it was almost like the idea that somebody could take a traditional blues, speed it up, and you know write it as a murder ballad at
Yeah.
200 beats per minute. The audacity of doing that was kind of, oh my god, I can't believe nobody thought to do this before.
It's brilliant. And I think he got that idea of Night of the Hunter of looking like Preacher Powell as well was a brilliant, and going into that whole deep south imagery.
Yeah,
It's
I mean, if ever there's an album sleeve that that looks like the record sounds, it's Miami. I mean, you can look at that sleeve and you know what that's going to sound like. You put the needle down and it sounds like that sleeve.
yeah. No, and it's quite I like the ghost of Jeffrey Lee is getting some good attention now, thanks to Cypress Grave and the Jeffrey Lee Pierce project, and that
Yeah,
installment has just come out, and he's a brilliant guy, Cypress Grave, and he's done loads of brilliant stuff with Lydia and with other people that it's so sad that, got to mention Jeffrey Lee, Mark Lanigan, his biggest disciple, that he
yeah.
was a victim of COVID as well, because God, he didn't get much longer on earth than Jeffrey Lee, actually, sadly enough.
No, no. It's I remember Mark Lanigan passing away, and I was kind of never a huge fan of I wasn't it wasn't that I wasn't into his music and stuff. I'd never really explored it, and I think him passing away made me go back and look at his work in a little bit more detail. I thought, God, there's some great stuff here.
What a boy.
Um, I know. Um, but yeah, just like you say, this kind of idea that um, trouble finds these people, unfortunately. But and like you said about the Cramps, kind of bringing rockabilly back. I think the
They were
trouble the trouble finds them, but they do something with it.
Well, Ivy said it was like her mission. As soon as they heard that music, it was their divine mission to bring it back. And it was, she said to me, I didn't seek it out, it found me. And yeah, and that's another one that's really sad that Lux and Ivy have been parted for the time being.
Yeah.
They were and when I looked at my old interviews with them, that's the thing that made me the saddest, that they wouldn't, they were connoisseurs of it all. Their house was, they had one room with science fiction records, one room with serial killer records. They had a whole collection of serial killer artwork. They were just the connoisseurs of trash culture, and they were so brilliant live. I do feel sorry for anyone who didn't get to see the Cramps, actually, because that was something else.
Yeah, and I think they they really typify a lot of what we're talking about in terms of they almost appeared fully formed with a
Yeah.
very definite image, a very definite sound. And if you say the Cramps to anyone who knows anything about them, y 1,000 pictures come into your head immediately.
Mm, yeah, exactly. And Brian Gregory probably being, you know, one of the people that people still hold him up as like that's the ultimate goth look. And that's what we were saying earlier, that the arch druid on Britannia was Brian Gregory.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. I'm gonna have to go back and look at that again, I think,
Yeah.
and maybe do a side by side. I might make that the thumbnail for this. Maybe do a side by side. Um,
He should be. I'm sure I'd love to know if Mackenzie Quick based that look on here on Brian Gregory, because I'm sure he did.
yeah, that'd be an interesting one. I might have to go down a bit of a rabbit hole and see if there's any info on that actually.
Mm.
Um, but to kind of talk about at a certain point, goth kind of went overground, didn't it? In terms of, Susie was
Yeah.
in the charts, The Cure were in the charts, and then later on in the 80s, kind of a little bit outside of the timeline of the book, The Mission started appearing, and obviously the cult broke through. Um,
Mm.
did you feel, as someone who was kind of writing about this stuff at the time and going to gigs, being involved in the subculture, did you feel was there a shift in attitude to the culture then?
Yeah, I think once it had become anything, once it gets into the mainstream and everyone likes it or has access to it, gets diluted, unfortunately. I think it was interesting. And again, Jim Thirlwell said that he thought it was so brilliant here in London up until about 83. And then that was when punk sort of got commodified and all the record labels then started having their own little indie wings that weren't really. And him and Lydia just went back to New York at that point. And then he started getting involved with people like Swans and Steve Albini. And I think that's where it went. The new wave of really brilliant music came from
Yeah.
weird outer reaches of America. And it was people who had got into this stuff, but then and got into the whole indie ethos of it as well, of do it yourself and all of that. That goth sort of bit went into grunge, what would be then be called grunge. It's kind of what I say in that form. And there is a really interesting fork where it goes one way it stays with guitars and one way it goes electronic, and that's again the sort of coil side of it, what you can do
Yeah.
with non-instruments and what you can do. So I followed the twang, being a Link Ray fan, but a lot of people did, and also, and then that goes, Killing Joke obviously were a big influence on a whole swathe of industrial music. And so it sort of forks off all these, like we said at the beginning, there's all these different styles of goth, and all the various different styles of it kickstarted something else. And
Yeah, Killing Joke are an interesting one because one of my favorite metal bands, is a band called Voivod,
yeah,
and they've gone on record numerous times saying they would not exist without the influence of Killing Joke. And really, if anybody hasn't heard Voivod, go and listen to Killing Technology and tell me that doesn't sound like an extension of what Killing Joke were doing on those early records, And I think Killing Joke, what this book did for me, even though I've been listening to Killing Joke since I was a teenager, what this book reaffirmed for me, or maybe just made me remember, is how early to this they were.
yeah, exactly, really early, 1979. Yeah, and Johnny Rotten, one of their first champions as well.
That's because the other thing we talked a little bit about this earlier, when punk kind of fractured, as Jim Thirlwell said, Big Bang expansion of the universe. I've always kind of two records always stand out for me in that regard, which is the first Banshees album
Mm,
and Pink Flag by Wire,
yeah,
which I think and I put Magazine in there as well. The interesting thing though is that the Banshees are the ones who kind of are the most associated with goth,
Mm.
whereas Pink Flag, for example, is not a goth record, and it's all these albums came out in a really similar time, immediately after the punk fallout.
Yeah.
And I always find that so fascinating in the way that I love the quote from that you wrote in the book about Joy Division, which I've got here. Yeah, so most Joy Division fans bridle at the word goth, but it's hard to imagine Oscar Wilde himself fashioning a story of beautiful doomed youth more tragic than that of Ian Curtis and the people who knew and loved him. And I think there's this interesting dichotomy that goth is this image-driven thing, but I can't hear Atrocity Exhibition and not the G word is there. Nothing says gothic to me like something like that.
Well, that's right. That it was brilliant finding that quote from Mary Harron. He has gone on to become like a brilliant filmmaker, and
Yeah,
she American Side. But her saying that it was like a form of Gothic, what they were doing, because in the sort of 17th century Gothic, it would be about castles and, but they were making a Gothic of that landscape, that brutalized, brutalist landscape,
yeah,
which, and that's another reason why I put in the Midnight Movies, have a look at Charlie Bubbles. If you can find that film, you'll see the state of what Manchester looked like at the time that Joy Division came into being, and how it was still bomb sites of the wall, and how those huge straight of it would just knock down houses and look like a flipping really scary wasteland, which, like Bernard Sumner says, was just destroying the communities and taking families away from the society they'd had and sticking them up in the stuff. No, and Joy Division captured all of that, and Martin Hannett, having him for their producer, he would say, "What's
yeah,
that? The sonic holograms," as he called them, of that.
yeah. And there's if nobody's seen the Joy Division documentary, it's just called Joy Division. Um, there's a really great and kind of tragic quote from Bernard Sumner where he says that I don't think I saw a tree until I was 9. When you hear Joy Division's music, that's
Yeah.
it, isn't it?
Oh, another classic film from that, from when they were growing up. Hell is a city, and that city is Manchester. That is set in Manchester. That really brilliant Stanley Baker film noir, one of the classic early British film noirs.
It's
Yeah.
interesting, isn't it? Because I was thinking about this a bit just before we came on actually. Um, there's been, and I don't know if this is kind of with hindsight what I've read as I've been kind of growing up and getting into this, or whether this was the feeling of the time that there was a bit of a divide in terms of sound between, when you listen to Manchester bands, they have a distinct sound. When you listen to Leeds bands, they have a distinct sound. And was that felt at the time?
Well, I think Northern Soul itself had quite a big impact. Joy Division, where Soft Cell, where actually Dave Ball and Mark Ullman both come from the other side of the left, the sinister side of the Pennines. And Northern Soul did have a massive impact, I think, those records on what those bands, the ideas they got, and what they sounded like, which wasn't anything that happened down south. It wasn't such a big thing. Although we did get it in Yarmouth. That was one of the good things about it being a tourist, having lots of B&Bs, because the Nouveau Mod scooter runs used to come round, and we used to get, that's the first time I heard that really brilliant. And I love Northern Soul music. It was a brilliant thing to listen to when you were in the 80s. It was, God, just such brilliant. Justin Sullivan's a massive Northern Soul fan, and he said,
Is he?
yeah, the stomping beat of New Model Army is largely derived from soul records and James Brown records, even though it doesn't sound anything on the surface like them. So I think, yeah, Northern Soul's a big cultural and musical thing that impacted on God. And another thing that I found really interesting was when not Leeds, Manchester, sorry, Leeds, Bradford had always been against each other in history. But what brought them together, the miners' strike and Goth, after centuries of fighting each other, the Civil War, the War of the Roses, all of that. And they
Hey,
had a common enemy. they they were together at last.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think, Leeds and Bradford, to me, when I think back to all of the bands from that time, I always think of goth belonging in the north.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree.
Purely because it's and when I say that, I suppose I mean that if we're talking about all of these bands being political, not in terms of lyrics necessarily, like a New Model Army or Theatre of Hate, for example, but just in terms of the mere fact that they exist against the grain,
Yeah.
um, because of what was going on in the north, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield as well, I suppose they kind of spat it out in the most earnest form.
Well, it's
Um,
where all civil wars were fought in the same places over the century. These were the heartland of that song "Heartland" by the Sisters. These were where all the pit villages were, and every pit village had its own goth club, as David Peace entertainingly described to me. And yeah, it is. That's what I love about when you do the history and you realise things don't happen in these places for no reason. They always did happen in these places.
Absolutely, and I think I've just finished Will Sargent's second book. He really puts that into perspective from Liverpool being a pop town, and you know the post-punk bands from Liverpool, the Bunnymen included, they had something about them. They could be as strange as they liked, and I think the Bunnymen probably had their apex of strange on Porcupine, and yet they always managed to do that in a
Yeah.
really succinct way. Whereas Sheffield, for example, you've got Cabaret Voltaire, kind of almost, it's like music concrete for a post-industrial city, isn't it? And even early Human League as well. The
Yeah.
two cities not too far apart from each other with just these completely polar opposite sounds.
Well, that was another one of Justin's interesting little things that he thinks. On the Lancashire side of the Pennines, it's Ireland, and on the Yorkshire side, it's still the Danelaw. So, but I loved Will Sargent's book, and I loved the fact it was still so haunted by the Beatles and the beat boom that that their manager Bill Drummond was getting them equipment that had been owned previously by people from that Gary and the Pacemakers and those sort of people.
Yeah.
And they're still making, that Liverpool's still completely haunted by the Beatles and what they did. And as a result of the Beatles existing, the infrastructure was there for the Bunnymen to, continue their work basically.
It's great because I think that, again, if anyone listening slash watching this hasn't read either of Will's books,
Read
they're
them.
such easy reads as
Them.
well. They're so entertaining, and the thing I love about Will is that he never shies away from saying, "Yeah, I listen to Status Quo," you know.
No,
Yeah, I listen to Slade, and I love that. I love that there's no elitism in
no.
his writing, and it's like I say, it's just so funny to
Well,
read.
I thought it was brilliant that, three of his favourite people were Led Zeppelin, the Beatles, and the Doors, and he meets all of them en
Yeah,
route in the story. It's like, yeah, you were on the right track, Will, and now here's Robert Plant, Ray Manzarek, and Paul McCartney to say so.
absolutely. So Cathi and I are gonna talk about our sort of great goth picks in a moment. But one last question, Cathi, on this topic before we
Yeah.
start to nerd out about records. Um, why do you think goth as a subculture has lasted this long?
Because I think it's part of something that's always been in our culture. I think it is a continuation of the Gothic that has been, William Blake and his Dark Satanic Mills at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, Justin Sullivan quoting them at the end of it. It's the same thing as what the decadence, the Dadaist, the surrealist. It's the darkness. It's trying to process and trying to express that darkness in our society in a way that transcends it in a way. Because, like we were saying, if you want a time capsule of Manchester in the 70s, just put on Joy Division. You know, we still remember William Blake's work. We still know the work of Percy Shelley and Mary Shelley and the Romantic poets, and they encapsulated it in a way that will just last down the ages. And these bands, I think, were part of that tradition.
Gets 2023, 3 new books about goth come out, including Season of the Witch. You know, people are talking about Bauhaus on TikTok. It's great, and everything kind of comes back around, doesn't it? And
That's
if
actually.
I kind of think, people might sneer. I don't use TikTok; it's not my thing at all. I'm too old for that. But people might sneer at that, and I do understand why. But the way I look at it is, I kind of think if 100 people see that and think, I really like that, I've never heard anything like Bela Lugosi's Dead before, I want to check this out, that's got to be a good thing, right?
That's the whole thing about doing fanzines. And, when I was lucky enough to write for Sounds, you just want to say, look, this record's so brilliant, this band is so wonderful, you must listen. And you just want to spread the love.
Absolutely. And that was the end of part 1. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening, listeners. Don't forget to share this around, leave a like, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Please go over to part 2 now if you want to hear Cathi and I nerding out about records, which, let's be honest, who wouldn't want to hear that? More of this voice. My name's Jay. Thank you very much for listening. This has been New Musical Chairs, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.